In this Powered Cube draft guide, I'll be telling you everything you need to know about Powered Cube before diving into the format. I'll be discussing what is Powered Cube, cube basics, keys to success, I'll provide some archetype overviews, and I'll round things out with some final tips. First, what is Powered Cube? Powered Cube is a draft format featuring the best cards in Magic history. It is fast and powerful, with gameplay that feels like a blend of limited and constructed. So, what are some cube basics? Well, for starters, there's fast mana, which means the games are very quick because people are going to be having some explosive turns early in the game, thanks to cards like Black Lotus, which lets you get 3 mana for just the cost of a card. You play Black Lotus, sacrifice it, get 3 mana. All of a sudden, you're casting a 4-drop on turn 1 or a 5-drop on turn 2. You're doing some really, really powerful things, and that's going to accelerate the games a lot. A card like Mox Ruby, which is one of 5 Moxen, 1 for each color, can just be cast for 0 and tap to add a mana to your mana pool. So it's like playing an extra land drop, but you don't have to do any work for it. You just get an extra land drop, and that just makes the games go quicker. And things like Mana Crypt similarly allows you to get 2 extra mana. So you just get huge bursts of mana early in the game, which means powerful threats are coming down very quickly. And remember, these are the most powerful cards in Magic history. So when you're playing these 4-drops and 3-drops ahead of schedule, they are really impactful. So what kinds of cards are you playing? Well, things like Ancestral Recall, 1 mana, draw 3 cards. Time Walk, 2 mana to take an extra turn. And like the most powerful removal spell ever, Swords to Plowshare. So these are some of the really powerful spells you're going to be working with, not to mention some of the key threats, which we're going to look at a lot of those threats later. But these are powerful, powerful spells. And so every time you're casting these, a little bit ahead of schedule, or even just casting them at all, you feel like you can get a significant advantage in the game. Now, there's also a category of cards I like to call synergy pieces, where they're not powerful on their own, but they work really well with the really powerful cards, and so they're still worth including. So a card like Zurin Orb, which is a 0 mana play, you can sack a land to gain 2 life. This is nowhere near the power level of the cards we've been looking at. But when you combine it with something like Balance, and then you sacrifice all of your lands when you cast your Balance, all of a sudden, your opponent has to sacrifice all of those lands. So Zurin Orb did a good job there. If you play a card like Titania, Protector of Argoth, all of a sudden you can sacrifice all of your lands to make an army of 5/3s, and Zurin Orb did good work there. And if you're really ambitious, you can combine Zurin Orb with Fast Bond and Crucible of Worlds to get infinite mana and infinite life, because Zurin Orb gains you 2 life when you sack a land, Fast Bond lets you play a land and lose a life, so you net 1 life there, and Crucible of Worlds lets you play those lands from your graveyard. So you're getting huge amounts of synergy from a card like Zurin Orb. So when you see these cards that look like they're terrible and you're wondering, what the heck is this doing in my Powered Cube? That's what they're there for. They're there for key synergies, and so keep an eye out for those, because if you're building a certain type of deck, you may really want these cards. And a lot of the times you can wheel them out of packs because other players might not be interested. So, what are keys to success in Powered Cube? First up, prioritize cheap spells. Next, mana fixing is essential. And third, you must have a plan. So, first up, prioritize cheap spells, cheap cards. And that's because expensive spells are all going to be fantastic. So these are the best cards in Magic history, as I've said multiple times already. But when you play these cards in a normal limited environment, they're like the best card not only in your deck, but in the entire format. So if you play an Elder Gargroth, a Glorybringer, a Grave Titan, you feel astronomically favored to win. But in a format like Powered Cube, there's also really good cheap spells. So if your opponent plays a Ragavan on turn 1, your Grave Titan isn't going to help you, because you might lose the game if you don't answer that Ragavan immediately. If you don't have a Spell Pierce for your opponent's accelerated out 4-drop that your opponent cast using Black Lotus, you might lose the game before you get to your 5-mana Glorybringer. And something like Ocelot Pride is similarly a snowbally card. These cheap spells keep you alive in the face of fast mana, where other players are going to have really fast things they can do, you're going to have really fast things you can do, and cheap spells ensure that you can actually cast the cards in your hand before they're irrelevant and the game is over, because the games are going to be quick. Cards are going to be cast really, they're deployed from your hand much more quickly because of all the fast mana available and things like that. And so you're going to want to make sure you have cheap spells so you can actually do things during the game instead of just sitting there with your really powerful, expensive cards in your hand and just not doing tons of stuff. So that's going to be key, is make sure you prioritize those cheap spells. And even better than cheap is free. So a card like Force of Will, which can counter target spell if you're willing to discard a blue card from your hand and pay a life, that's a really good card in this format, because the cards that you're going to be casting are going to get you card advantage. They're so powerful, they're going to get you 2-for-1, 3-for-1 sometimes even, and so being willing to throw away cards to get mana advantage is essential. Solitude, similarly, you pitch a card, but you get to kill something without having to spend mana. Snuff Out, you just pay 4 life, you get to kill something. It's really, really nice to have free spells in your deck, especially if you weren't lucky enough to get something like a Mox, where you're not going to be as fast as your opponent's decks. You can at least answer the threats that they are accelerating out. Next, mana fixing is essential. So in a typical limited format, you're going to have like 9-8 mana bases, so like 9 mountains, 9 mountains, 8 islands in a blue-red deck or something like that. That mana is terrible. You end up with situations where you can't cast your spells quite frequently, where you have like a blue card in your hand and you drew all mountains the entire game and you can't cast your spells. In Vintage Cube, you don't have to live like that. You can have a great mana base by prioritizing the lands, and that's important to do because, as we already mentioned many times, every single spell is really, really good. So it's not like, oh, I'm cutting my last card for my deck, it's terrible. It's like the last card you're cutting is like would have been the best card in its respective format a lot of the time. So you're going to have really powerful cards to work with, and so making sure you have really good mana is going to make sure you don't lose those games to poor mana that you would lose in other formats. The key to this is oftentimes going to be fetch lands. Fetch lands are really good. There's plenty of dual lands and things like that you can take, and you should take. But fetch lands are the creme de la creme that you can be taking because of something I'll show you in a moment. But a fetch land is a card that can sacrifice itself to search for an island or a mountain in the case of Scalding Tarn, but they search for one of two different land types. But importantly, it's not a basic land. So if you combine a fetch land with a dual land or a shock land, so if you have a Scalding Tarn plus an Underground Sea, all of a sudden your Scalding Tarn can get 3 colors, because it can get an island, a mountain, or your Underground Sea, which is an island, so you can fetch it up with your Scalding Tarn, but it's also a swamp, so you can get a black source with your Scalding Tarn. If you have a Sacred Foundry, you can get a white source with your Scalding Tarn. So all of a sudden, if you have Scalding Tarn, Underground Sea, and Sacred Foundry, your Scalding Tarn is a 4-color land, which is really, really powerful, obviously. 4-color, and it's untapped in this case with the lands I've chosen to display here. So this fetch plus dual land combo is really, really nice and helps you have really good mana, especially if you're stretching your mana base, splashing, doing things like that. Making sure you prioritize these cards is going to be absolutely essential, and especially those fetch lands. Next, you must have a plan. Since every card is powerful, the way to gain an advantage is by ensuring your cards work well together, and there are some very powerful synergies built in to Powered Cube that you can look for, and we're going to be covering these plans that you can maybe go for now with some archetypes. Now, I will say there are more archetypes in the Powered Cube than I'm going to be able to cover here because it is such a big, diverse format. There's so many little micro synergies and things you can try to assemble, but these are going to be big archetypes that you'll see draft in and draft out, as well as hopefully expanding your horizons of what you can kind of think of as being possible in a draft format, because a lot of these things feel like playing constructed decks. First up, mono white aggro. It's a great place to start if you're a beginner. It's also just a very powerful deck in general, no matter your level in the Powered Cube. You get to avoid the issue of having bad mana by not having to take those lands because you're playing mono white. You also get to have a nice bunch of cheap cards, which we already talked about being important because you're being an aggro deck. So you play tons of cheap cards, tons of 1-drops, 2-drops, things like that, which is just really, really nice. And your cards are quite good. So Mother of Rune's a really good 1-drop, Felly a really good 2-drop. There's plenty of good 1 and 2-drops in white decks. Parallax Wave is a great top-end finisher for this type of strategy. There's also red aggro decks. They're not quite as good as white aggro decks. The card quality is a little bit lower, and you don't have quite as many disruptive elements to stop some of the more broken decks we're going to cover in a moment. But you still get a nice aggressive game plan. Magda Brazen Outlaw is a good 2-drop that can help you snowball. Broadside Bombardiers is fantastic, a really good card for any deck, but especially if you're being aggressive. Lightning Bolt, premium burn spells, those are things that red aggro decks gain access to. You also don't have to play mono red aggro. You can just be like blue-red tempo with red aggro elements, things like that as well. Definitely something you can do. Now, there is something to note. If you are trying to play a multicolored aggro deck, like a red-white deck, make sure you have the lands to support it. One of the strengths of these decks is they don't have to prioritize the lands, so they can just get really good curves, really high card quality, without having to prioritize the mana to cast all of these spells. If you are going into multiple colors, make sure you have not only the lands, but also the power level to justify hurting your mana base in that way. Now, moving on to another deck, Green Ramp. Now, this isn't always an archetype in and of itself. Green Ramp can also just be a good supplement to your other strategies. You can play a green-red deck that uses the Green Ramp to accelerate out bigger threats. You can play a green-blue deck that uses Green Ramp to accelerate out card draw and control elements, things like that. But Green Ramp is a really nice way to get some acceleration into your deck if you don't get the artifact fixing like the Moxen. So Birds of Paradise, Noble Hierarch, Ignoble Hierarch, they start your game plan on turn 1 and immediately let you skip a spot on your curve, and so casting something like Sentinel of the Nameless City on turn 2, Minsc and Boo Timeless Heroes on turn 3 can be a really nice way to get some wins. So keep that in mind if you are trying to play green. It doesn't always get highlighted as much in some of the other decks that I'm going to be covering, but I did want to mention that if you're trying to play a green deck, the acceleration can be useful for any strategy you're going for a lot of the time. Next, Artifacts. Artifacts is a really Powered Cube type deck. You play really powerful cards ahead of schedule thanks to huge mana engines. So cards like Grim Monolith, which you play for 2 mana, and then the next turn you have access to 6 mana because you play your third land and then you can tap the Grim Monolith for 3 mana. You're casting big spells ahead of schedule. Urza High Lord Artificer lets you turn any of your small artifacts into basically Mox Sapphires. You can tap them to add blue mana, and so you have a bunch of artifacts in play. You're all of a sudden tapping them for huge amounts of mana. You get a giant construct when you play Urza. It's the perfect card for the artifacts deck. And then Tolarian Barbarian Academy is a fantastic card for this deck. It's a land that can tap for tons of mana, and so using all of this mana to just overwhelm your opponents is a key aspect of what Artifact is trying to do. And some of the cards you might cast are Ugin Eye of Storms, great 7-drop. It's colorless, so you can use your colorless mana to cast it. And when you cast your colorless spells, so like your other artifacts, you can start exiling your opponent's stuff while getting card advantage doing Ugin things. Upheaval is fantastic in this deck. You can wait and have all of your mana. You have tons of mana available compared to what other people have, your opponents have, and then you tap all of your mana, cast Upheaval, bounce all of your permanents, and then you have the mana floating to redeploy a lot of your cards, and then pass the turn to your opponent, who then usually plays a land and discards like 15 cards to hand size or whatever it is, and you just promptly win the game. Kappa Cannoneer can be another nice tool for this sort of deck. You get it out ahead of schedule and use it to just beat your opponent before they do anything. Next is a Reanimator deck. This is another classic Powered Cube archetype. You play something like Entomb to get a big creature into your graveyard, Reanimate to bring it back. Archon of Cruelty is a great creature to use for these purposes because it gets you card advantage, it gains you life, makes your opponent lose life, sacrifice creatures. It just does the whole package. It's a great card for this sort of thing. There's plenty of redundancy. You can use Faithless Looting or draw and discard effects to discard your big creatures directly into your graveyard. Animate Dead is another reanimation spell, and then Atraxa-Grain Unifier, another example of the sort of big creature you can get into play. There's also kind of this Reanimator asterisk deck where you have a card like Flash, which lets you put the creature from your hand directly into play and then sacrifice it. So there are some cards like Torsten, which you don't mind doing that with because you'll end up with 7/1/1s when he dies. You get its Enter's effect. Sneak Attack also can be a nice little Reanimator asterisk type card where you put the card into play temporarily, but a lot of the time it doesn't matter because it was so powerful that you win anyway. So keep an eye out for these when you're playing Reanimator, especially because a lot of the cards that you'll want are going to work in both of those types of strategies. Next is Storm. This is a classic Powered Cube deck. I've said that with the past few, but this is the sort of deck that you only really play in Powered Cube, or maybe even in a constructed format. You're not playing these in a normal draft format. So a card like Dark Ritual, which you just play the card, it gets you mana, and doesn't do anything else for you, that's the sort of card you're playing in your Storm deck. There's a few different types of cards that do that in Powered Cube, but you play your Dark Ritual, for example, you play a couple of other spells, then you play Yawgmoth's Will, or some other similar type of card that lets you get a bunch of more access to more spells. So you play Yawgmoth's Will, you recast your Dark Ritual, recast your other spells that you cast that turn, and then you finish your opponent off with maybe a Tendrils of Agony, which has the Storm mechanic, so you copy it for each spell you played before. That's a really sort of powerful thing you can do in this format. Now, a classic Storm combo you can go for is the combo of Lion's Eye Diamond, Brain Freeze, or Underworld Breach. Lion's Eye Diamond can be replaced with Black Lotus if you're lucky enough to get one. But basically, because Brain Freeze can target yourself, you can cast Lion's Eye Diamond, you cast Brain Freeze targeting yourself, you fill your graveyard a little bit, you cast your Underworld Breach, and then all of a sudden your Lion's Eye Diamond can be used to get the mana you need to cast Brain Freeze. It doesn't matter that you have no cards in hand because you cast Lion's Eye Diamond from your graveyard by exiling 3 cards, use the mana that Lion's Eye Diamond generated to cast Brain Freeze, target yourself, mill yourself for some cards, use the extra cards to fuel casting Lion's Eye Diamond again, use it to cast Brain Freeze again, and then you build up Storm count enough to eventually Brain Freeze your opponent out of the game. It's a really good 3-card combo, and definitely something to keep in mind for if you're looking to play a Storm deck. Now, there is the final deck that I want to talk about here. It's not the last deck in the format. You can do tons of cool things, but the last deck I want to talk about is Control, because there are definitely decks that are the fun police. They're trying to stop these unfair decks. And what you want to have is you want to have hand disruption, you want to have stack disruption. So counter spells and discard spells are key. So a card like Thoughtseize can pick your opponent apart. If they're playing a Reanimator deck and you Thoughtseize them and take their only Animate Dead or their only Reanimator spell, all of a sudden they're just looking at a bunch of expensive cards that they can't ever get back into play. If you have one counterspell for their key card that they're trying to resolve when they're maybe trying to Storm combo kill you, then playing your mana drain can absolutely stop that. But if you're just relying on removal spells, your Control deck is often going to fall flat because there's so many powerful decks that don't rely on having creatures stick into play to be good. They're just using like the creature for their enter the battlefield effect, or they just have really powerful alternate strategies that don't rely on creatures at all. Still, you do gain access to really powerful cards like Fractured Identity. And I just want to emphasize this one more time by showing off a few more cards. Duress, Hand Disruption, Remand, Stack Disruption, and then Fire Covenant, just the sort of absurd board clearing effect that you gain access to in a format like Powered Cube, where you can just like take out pretty much all of your opponent's creatures if you have a high enough life total. Moving on to some final tips before we wrap this up. First up, there are draw 7s in this format. In a normal environment, draw 7s wouldn't be very good because your opponent gets just as many resources as you do. But in Powered Cube, you have access to fast mana that we already talked about, so you can cast a couple of fast mana spells and then cast a draw 7, and your opponent maybe draws 2 cards out of it. They go from 5 to 7, and you go from like 2 to 7, so you just get a huge advantage there. Or you combine your draw 7, like Time Twister, Wheel of Fortune, Time Spiral, these really powerful potentially effects, with a draw 7 Punisher like Narset Parter of Veils, which stops them from drawing more than one card each turn, Shieldred the Apocalypse, which makes them take damage when they draw cards, and Hull Breacher, which also stops them from drawing cards and gets you a bunch of treasure. So that's the sort of thing where if you have these draw 7s, you can play these draw 7 Punishers and really wreck your opponent. But if you have the right build, then you'll be wanting to play the draw 7s anyway, because you can play a bunch of fast mana, play a draw 7, refuel your hand, play more fast mana, do some really crazy stuff with your Storm deck or whatever. So draw 7 is definitely something you can play in Powered Cube, even though they're not really something you'd want in a lot of other formats for limited. Also, tutors. There are really powerful 2-card combos in this set, in this format, so having tutors is really, really nice. So a card like Vampiric Tutor, which puts you down a card just to put a card on top of your deck, can absolutely be worth playing if you're potentially playing like a Reanimator deck, or maybe you put a Wheel on top of your deck, so a draw 7. So your opponent has 6 cards in hand, you cast your Vampiric Tutor, you have like 2 cards in hand, all of a sudden you're going to be both drawing a fresh 7. Or you have a Reanimator deck and you put your Reanimation card on top, or whatever you're missing, because that's the kind of thing is, there's a lot of decks that are 2-card combo decks where you need Reanimation spell, plus a way to get that creature into your graveyard, so you can kind of tutor for whichever piece you're missing, and it provides a lot of redundancy. So cards like Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Mystical Tutor, don't be afraid of playing these cards just because tutors aren't always worth it in a normal Magic set. Then in Powered Cube, they're oftentimes going to be great cards for your deck. And then finally, hate cards. So artifact destruction spells and graveyard destruction, like Graveyard Hate, are absolutely worth playing in Powered Cube. So a card like Pest Infestation is very, very strong. In some environments, there might not be tons of artifacts running around, so you might wonder, oh, do I want to play this sort of card? In Powered Cube, there are lots of artifacts. There's lots of enchantments. There's lots of things you can blow up. So cards like Pest Infestation are great. A card like Containment Priest, which stops your opponent from reanimating their creatures, can be really, really powerful for your deck. A card like Soul Guide Lantern, a colorless graveyard interaction spell that's also a cheap artifact for your artifacts deck, can be a card that you're really happy playing. So make sure you prioritize these cards, especially if you're playing best of 3 where you'll get to sideboard. These cards are going to be really good, especially because some of the decks are really hard to interact with if you are playing just a typical like reasonable deck. If you're playing against a Reanimator deck, you're going to want to have access to some hate cards. If you're playing against an artifact deck, having some extra hate cards can go a long way. The final thing I want to say is that you need to have a good mindset when playing Powered Cube. Make sure you have a good mindset because games can be incredibly swingy and often there's nothing you can do. Sometimes your opponent is going to go turn 1, Dark Ritual, get 3 mana, cast Entomb, put the creature into the graveyard, cast Reanimate, and bring the creature back, and you just had nothing you could do. They did it on turn 1, the game was just over. Or they go turn 1, play land, play Black Lotus, sacrifice it, cast a 4-drop on turn 1, and the game is just basically over. That's going to happen in Powered Cube. You kind of sign up for that when you play it and you want to play these powerful cards. Sometimes your opponent is going to have those powerful cards. So keep that in mind. You can do your best to combat it by having free spells of your own, by doing your best to draft a good deck, but sometimes these things are going to happen. You have to be willing to roll with the punches if you're going to be playing Powered Cube, so have a good mindset. That's going to do it for this one, though. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback, and leave hashtag PowerDrafter in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.